What range of motion should you be using for any given exercise and for any given goal? Let's start off by saying that strength and performance are range of motion specific, meaning that whatever range of motion you're training in for any given movement, that's the range of motion you're going to perform best in. This is actually very similar to rep range and performance, where whatever rep range you're training in, that's the rep range you're going to be able to perform best in for a given movement pattern. So let's set performance to the side for a second and look at, with regards to hypertrophy, what range of motion contributes to our goals the best. Well, for a while, based on the literature that we had available to us, it was thought that a full range of motion was king. That was the most ideal thing we could do for the purposes of training for hypertrophy. And this was based on a plethora of studies comparing full range of motion to shortened partials, meaning exercises that are performed in the shortened half of the range of motion for that exercise. But more and more, we're starting to have evidence that shows performing an exercise with a partial range of motion in the lengthened portion, lengthened with regards to muscle length, may actually contribute to hypertrophy significantly more than does a normal full range of motion. Let's get into all of this and begin to unpack it. So the first thing to consider here is that as you increase your range of motion, the number of reps you're able to do at any given weight decreases. And similarly, the weight you can lift for some number of reps decreases. So more range of motion means lower performance or lower ability to produce force over time. Next, it's important to consider which parts of the range of motion are most important to emphasize for the sake of hypertrophy. And we know that the lengthened portion, the peak stretch of the exercise, is the most important portion of any given movement. We also know that the eccentric is a substantial contributor to a robust hypertrophy stimulus. And we know that the peak contraction likely contributes very little to hypertrophy. So putting this together with the previous idea that with increased range of motion comes decreased ability to perform reps and or lift more load, we can make a couple conclusions or recommendations here. The first is that for many exercises, focusing on the peak contraction of a given exercise might actually be detrimental insofar as it reduces the number of reps you're able to do, whereas compared to a variation of the same exercise where you are focusing only on the peak stretch and less on the peak contraction, I'm demonstrating rows here, you might be able to perform more reps of an average longer muscle length, which might give substantially more hypertrophy stimulus. It's important to consider that we don't have enough literature to fully suggest just getting rid of any focus on a peak contraction in every exercise across the board. However, it might be a good idea to make an assessment on a per exercise basis where you play around with doing a session where you do focus on that peak contraction and a different session where you don't focus on the peak contraction, standardizing everything else in terms of total number of sets, focusing on the peak stretch throughout. And if you compare the two and you assess how is my pump after I perform all of my working sets in my target muscle, how is the amount of muscle disruption or weakness that I'm experiencing in my target muscle following all of the sets for that exercise? How is my mind muscle connection during the exercise? How much did I feel my target muscle working? Did I feel the tension on my target muscle on the lower end of the rep range, or did I feel a gnarly burn in that target muscle on the higher end of the rep range? And how sore did I get in the hours and days following that given session? The more of these things you experience after performing a given variation, the more likely it is that you've experienced a robust hypertrophy stimulus. And so after performing this assessment and seeing which variation contributes more to experiencing more pump, more disruption, more mind muscle connection, and more soreness, whichever one of those does that is likely the one to go with. And I can tell you a personal anecdote here. I tried this out with almost every exercise in my training program, and I found that for certain exercises, for example, in my chest supported machine rows, when I squeeze in the peak contraction, Yeah, I get a better mind muscle connection, but I'm able to perform significantly less reps because I'm expending so much energy to get that squeeze at the top. It's very difficult to do. I'm able to get way less reps. The pump isn't as good. The muscle disruption is about the same, and the soreness is significantly less compared to when I don't focus as much on the peak contraction at the top. I'm just focusing on the stretch portion and just kind of stopping once I get near that peak contraction, going back down. I find that I get significantly more sore. I get a great pump. The mind muscle connection is nearly the same and the muscle disruption is insane. So comparatively, the stimulus I get from that is way higher. And actually the amount of fatigue I experience just in terms of mentally and my central nervous system fatigue is substantially lower. Whereas for machine preacher curls for my biceps, I found that when I emphasize the peak contraction at the top just for a second, not too long, I find that I get significantly better pumps, mind muscle connection, and disruption. Soreness is about equated. However, in that specific case, it was worth it for me to include those peak contractions for my machine preacher curls. So when you go about deciding whether or not you want to do away with a peak contraction for any given exercise, that's the assessment to make. Compare the perceived stimulus measured by the pump, disruption, mind muscle connection, and soreness to the amount of fatigue you'd experience for that exercise, central nervous system fatigue, joint and connective tissue fatigue, mental and emotional fatigue, and then see what has the better stimulus to fatigue ratio. Now, with regards to training for connective tissue health, right? Because everything we've talked about so far has been either with regards to performance or with regards to maximizing muscle hypertrophy. When we're talking about training to maximize the health and ability and strength of connective tissue, there's a couple things to consider. The first is that with regards to strength and performance, connective tissue adapts very similarly to muscle in this way, where it is range of motion specific. To me, this suggests that we should be training our connective tissue through a maximum range of motion with more emphasis on the peak stretch, because that's where the joint and the connective tissue is in its most vulnerable position generally, for the purpose of making the connective tissue and making the joints more strong, more functional, and less injury prone in those positions. Out of all the things we can be doing in our life in terms of activities and sports, strength training is a very controlled environment where we can elicit these stresses in a way which actually promotes adaptation and promotes strengthening with very low injury risk when done properly. So if the goal is to make connective tissue stronger and more capable and reduce injury risk, it's important to train your connective tissue through the range of motion that they'll be exposed to either in daily life, in activity, or in sport, so that when they're exposed to that range of motion and high forces in whatever activity you're doing, they're ready for it. They've been trained for it and they have adapted to that so that they're able to perform without a risk of rupture or injury. So to wrap everything up, strength and performance are range of motion specific. So if your goal is to become stronger for a specific lift, let's say you're a power lifter training the 3 competition lifts, squat, bench, and deadlift, you should be standardizing your range of motion and form to whatever it is you're planning on performing in your competition and training specifically through that range of motion, emphasizing load progressions, thus becoming as strong as possible over time in that specific range of motion. Training for hypertrophy and connective tissue health, on the other hand, should really focus on taking any given muscle group or target tissues to their peak stretched position for any given exercise, ideally with more load placed on those tissues while in that peak stretched position, with not as much emphasis being placed at the peak contraction, unless your assessment for stimulus to fatigue ratio suggests that you should be keeping in those peak contractions in any given exercise variation. Connective tissue adaptations, similar to muscular performance and strength adaptations, are range of motion specific, insofar as your connective tissue will become stronger, more functional, and less injury prone in the ranges of motion that you're training it in. If you are performing any sport or activity, or even just trying to prepare your body for the stressors of daily life, the goal should be to take any given joint or a piece of connective tissue or muscle through the maximum range of motion that you might experience in any of those situations so that you have fully adapted and strengthened your connective tissue and your joints and your muscles to handle that range of motion and those joint angles and to be able to produce force with low injury risk. And at the end of the day, the question of should you focus more on the peak stretch or the peak contraction? Yeah, you should probably be focusing quite a bit on the peak stretched position. And whether or not you focus on the peak contraction as well should be based on what has the better stimulus to fatigue ratio. And as always, if you like the video, drop a like and subscribe to support the channel. And if you have any questions or an idea that you'd like me to talk about in a future video, drop it in the comments down below.